All right, guys. Tonight's notes are entitled the 1863 Turning Point Battles. Up to this point in the war, the first 2 years of the war, we've seen that the South has really had an advantage in terms of fighting. At least they've been able to fight to a stalemate. And really, that's part of their plan, is just to wear the North out. The Union hasn't really had any significant military victories. The Battle of Antietam, they could kind of claim as a win, but really it was a tie. So the South has had, we'll say, the upper hand in the Civil War up to this point. But in 1863, the tide begins to turn in the Civil War. And there's a lot that goes into this. Where we talk about any of the battles, it's important to understand, remembering that ABCs of the Anaconda Plan that we talked about. The B was the blockade of the South. At the beginning of the war, the South or North didn't really have enough ships to have a true blockade of the South. But by 1863, the North had built enough ships to make a more effective blockade. And so the blockade is causing real problems in the South. Since they couldn't ship out many of their cash crops, especially cotton, they couldn't buy or bring in much of the things that they needed to continue fighting. Things like weapons and ammunition and medicine. So by 1863, Robert E. Lee is realizing that he's not just going to be able to wear out the North. The South is under too much pressure with this blockade. He needs to kind of take another gamble, take another risk, and he decides to invade the North again. And this time he decides to invade Pennsylvania. He had realized that the South couldn't last indefinitely. They weren't going to be able to just wear this North out at this point. So he hoped to convince the Northerners to give up by bringing the battle to them, bring the fighting to them. And so we see a major battle takes place in Gettysburg. Gettysburg is not all that far from Washington, D.C. in Pennsylvania. And Gettysburg had much needed supplies for the Confederates, especially shoes. The soldiers, when you think you're a soldier, you're marching a lot. Shoes wear out, needs new shoes for his army. You wouldn't think this is a very big deal, but imagine having to march 20 miles a day without shoes on your feet. And so there's originally some skirmishes that take place around the town of Gettysburg, but as these skirmishes grow and troop reinforcements arrive, full-fledged battle breaks out. And it really takes place over 3 days, July 1st through the 3rd, 1863. In the first 2 days of the battle, it's kind of going back and forth between these two groups. Lots of heavy fighting, lots of skirmishes, but really no one side is gaining the advantage. But then on the 3rd day of the battle is when the fighting is the most intense. In a famous moment, Pickett's charge is when Robert E. Lee sends forward a lot of his troops to the center of the Union line, hoping to break it, forcing them to run. And in this fateful charge, these Confederate troops are beaten back by Union troops. And it ends up being a terrible loss for Lee and the Confederacy. The South lost the Battle of Gettysburg. Lee lost over a third of his army. Really shifts the tide in the Civil War. Gettysburg is known as the high tide of the Confederacy. That's about as far as the Confederacy could go. All right, it had reached its maximum strength, maximum potential at that point. Up to that point, the South had been fairly successful on the battlefield, but after Gettysburg, Lee is not going to have enough men to mount another serious attack. He's going to have to shift strategies and basically just defend and retreat, just hoping to keep Richmond safe as long as possible. Meanwhile, at pretty much the same time that the Battle of Gettysburg is going on in the East, out west, Ulysses S. Grant has been taking over key spots on the Mississippi River for the Union. He'd taken several major towns and cities, and the only spot left to conquer by this point in 1863 was the city of Vicksburg, Mississippi. And Grant's army had surrounded the city and laid siege to it, but the people of Vicksburg refused to surrender. So he used artillery to continuously bombard the city and basically keep the people stuck there. And the people of Vicksburg lived in horrible conditions during this time. They ran out of food and ended up having to eat rats and horses. And this continued bombardment of the city forced many people to dig and live in caves to avoid these artillery firings. But by July 4th, so right around the same time as Gettysburg is ending, 1863, Vicksburg finally surrendered. So after these turning point battles of Gettysburg and Vicksburg, the Civil War itself is on a turning point. Lee's army has been badly damaged, and he was forced to focus on defending Richmond from the north. Remember, that's the A of the Anaconda Plan. The blockade was working better. The South wasn't able to get out as many of its cash crops, so the B was more effective. And then finally, the C was to cut the Confederacy in half. And at this point, that's been achieved. The North controlled the entire Mississippi River and had cut the Confederacy in half.